We now move for questions, but because of time, we are opening the floor for only 3 questions. So as earlier, if you have a question, please raise your hand and the ushers will bring a microphone to your table. Classic. Can we have a microphone to Dr. Chong Seng's table? Thank you.
Okay, according to Seychelles folklore, if you plant a coco de mer, you can tell whether it's going to be a male tree or a female tree just by the shape. Since SIF is already doing that, I'm just wondering whether you can tweak your approach by just taking a picture of every seed that you give out or you sell to the public for, so that in 20 or so years we can say whether this is absolute rubbish or there's some scientific evidence.
As part of my PhD work, I took pictures of probably 100 nuts, and they're all numbered. They're part of the regeneration scheme, so that can be looked back at later.
All right. Questioned and answered. Do we have any other questions in the room? Yes, Professor Edwards.
Well, I'd like to ask a question about the yellow crazy ant. And I think it's been such a success. I remember in 2018 we were so worried, and then they said, well, you put out these little traps, and I thought, ants? Really? I can't believe that it'll be successful. And I was completely wrong, and it is astonishing how the numbers have declined. But my question is, what does the future hold? I mean, are we now on a sort of permanent treadmill to monitor and to some extent control the ants? And is there anything else that can be done to reduce the labor of keeping it ant-free?
So when we started to look only at the Valle de Me. We then included a buffer zone, so it became even more work for everybody involved. But one slide of Lorraine was actually showing very well that we are looking at exactly at that. How can we be as effective by reducing the control that is required? So we are looking now at reducing the area, but having like a ring more around the Valle de Me as a buffer. And again, we have to count and keep counting for us to know how successful this is going to be. So to answer your question, for the time being, we'll have to continue, but we are looking at it, how much effective we can do so every time. Before every baiting, all the data of the jamming are being analyzed to say, this time we don't have to go for all of the valley, but rather round and do the boundary only. So we are using the results like in time for us to make decisions and to reduce what is required. There's a question by the team also about the chemicals, because we are still using the same chemical, whether there might be some resistant at one point in time. So we have to keep going, and I think Lorraine also rightly said so. We will need to follow what is happening on the international scene and whether there are other possible technologies that can be employed so that we don't have to do it as labor intensive as it is now.
Okay, thank you. One last question to the table in the front.
Okay, thank you. A fascinating presentation. Just a question. Pardon my technical ignorance a little bit, but in terms of, coco de mer, is there in terms of regulation, or maybe it doesn't sit, with environment, maybe it sits with trade or elsewhere. But I just wanted to know basically, as far as biodiversity is concerned, so be it coco de mer that is elsewhere, either as you mentioned earlier, traded or gifted or whatever it is. But do we still have, control is not a nice word, and for the want of a better word, but do we still have certain, as far as the biodiversity, the genetics, all that aspect of it. So if one day a laboratory somewhere where there is coco de mer is so advanced that it discovers that there's a cure for cancer or something like that, will we be able to, I wouldn't say capitalize on that, but is it still ours in that sense? So, thank you.
That's a very good question. In fact, the Convention on Biological Diversity is driving home the point that the place, the country that has been looking after its resources should actually also be involved in whenever any properties would be found for medical cure that therefore generate income, that this income goes back not simply for the country but to protect the species. So that is on an international level. And in Seychelles, what we did fairly early on is then whenever somebody would purchase a coco de mer that would be viable, which means it could grow in any other place, the material transfer agreement, as it is called, was signed, which is sort of signing off any rights, and also signing that whenever any medical properties would be found, that this needs to be declared and that further negotiations need to happen. So that is where it is, but obviously one can come back and say in Sri Lanka, in the Botanical Garden, I've seen the avenue. In Singapore, there is coco de mer growing. Florida, so there are many places where the coco de mer is growing, but these are single specimens, so they wouldn't really lend themselves sufficiently into this kind of exploitation. So anyone would need to come back to Seychelles and make official agreements if it would come to that such point, which also means that the conservation work for the coco de mer then should be benefit from that.
All right, thank you. Because of time, if you have any other questions, we'll be having a gathering right after. So if you have any questions for our speakers, you might ask them after the session. Without further ado, I'd like to say thank you to our speakers. A round of applause for them.